Long before the modern classroom, there were monasteries humming with scribes, madrasas echoing with philosophical debate, and universities bursting with new thought. These institutions shaped religion, culture, science, and power across 3 continents. Today, we explore how these intellectual giants of the medieval world forged the foundations of our modern age. Medieval monasteries were pivotal institutions in both European and Asian societies, characterized by their unique blend of religious devotion, communal living, and cultural influence. Inhabited by monks and or nuns, they followed strict rules for living and going about their day, though varying from place to place. They were typically built in remote and tranquil locations, and although not always, away from urban centers, to facilitate a life of contemplation and isolation from worldly distractions. They often featured a complex layout of buildings arranged around a central courtyard or cloister. These monastic communities were not only centers of spiritual practice, but also hubs of learning, craftsmanship, and agricultural productivity. Though, as this video will soon discuss, monasteries often became politically involved with their local nobles or government. These institutions often had moral battles between being faithful to their monastic rules and religion, and using their influence to exert political power. To attribute to God, and not to self, whatever good one sees in oneself, but to recognize always that the evil is one's own doing, and to impute it on oneself. Saint Benedict of Nursia. Saint Benedict's rule for monasteries. Christian monasteries were first developed in Egypt and Syria in the 4th century. These monks left to live on the fringes of urban society in isolation, not just to be able to pray in silence, but to avoid sin. Eventually these fringe monasteries, along with later urban monasteries, would often support the local people with food, beds, prayer, and more. This idea would be transported to the Byzantines and Latin Christendom by the 5th century, and heavily copied. There could be a couple reasons why monastic life took such a hold in medieval Europe, specifically Latin Christendom. Living a monastic life was actually pretty easy. There were certain activities and vows that one was held to, but these were not always strictly enforced. Another feature was that they were protected by the monastery itself, since most were somewhat reinforced. They also made copious amounts of money, which will be explained in more detail later. A second reason, contributing to the emergence of this institution, was the societal need for authoritative figures following the decline of Rome. Previously, the Roman emperor and its institutions had provided such figures. However, in the post-Roman era, individuals found themselves under new rulers and governance structures. Consequently, they turned to religion for guidance. The ascendance of the Pope notably fulfilled this need on a broader scale. Moreover, on a local level, people often sought leadership from regional lords or domestic communities. This dynamic not only facilitated the rise of feudalism, the predominant social system in medieval Europe, but also underscored how ordinary individuals sought support and spiritual direction from monks and monasteries. Saint Benedict of Nursia would create the foundations of monasticism in Latin Christendom in the year 529 AD. He created not only rules but a routine that would last for 1,500 years. He is not only regarded as the founder of Western Christian monasticism, but also declared the patron saint of Europe in 1964 by Pope Paul VI. Firstly, we will focus on monasteries in Latin Christendom, which are generally the areas of France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, Britain, and some of Germany. Despite the persisting claim that the medieval period in Europe was a dark age, these monasteries were hubs of knowledge. Following the reconquista of Muslim Iberia in the 8th century, Greek, Roman, and Arabic texts were brought back into Europe, and monks often were the ones to copy these manuscripts and transcribe them into Latin. This is way more important than one was to realize. The ability to read and write during the medieval period was very rare, and the average person could not do either. Without monks, this knowledge could have not become available to Europeans. Preserving knowledge was not the only role they played in society, though. They often provided healthcare to the sickly and hospitality to travelers. They would give out some of the food they grew to local peoples. They produced music and artwork. Women even had opportunities for work. Although rare and hard to obtain, one could become an abbess, making them the head of a convent. a very important role for women during a time when they did not have many. Finally, these monasteries provided noble boys with education and opportunities for ecclesiastical careers. These students were taught valuable skills like effective writing and speech, and also oratorical skills. This helped partially to create a new intellectual elite in Europe at a time when governments desperately needed educated bureaucracies. It is important to note, though, that almost all of these young boys would have come from high-status families. It was rare to see someone of humble origins. These religious institutions were not isolated from politics. Under Charlemagne and subsequent rulers, many monasteries became entwined with feudal power structures. Nobles often appointed their vassals as abbots, leading to a paradox. Institutions founded on humility and detachment became wealthy, politically active powerhouses, sometimes contrary to the values of their founders like Saint Benedict. These monasteries often fell under the control of feudal lords because of vassalage and the rise of feudalism. Furthermore, their many patrons made these institutions immensely huge and wealthy, and their noble leaders could use this money and land however they pleased. It's hard to say in words how wealthy these institutions were, not just in Latin Christendom, but in all other parts of the world. Glory to God who has thought me worthy to finish this work. Solomon, I have outdone you. Justinian I. While Latin monasteries operated independently from royal courts, in Byzantium the lines between church and state were blurred. Here, emperors were not just political leaders, but spiritual overseers. This fusion shaped monastic life in profound and often turbulent ways. Monasteries within the Byzantine Empire shared foundational similarities with their Western European counterparts, but swiftly diverged, forging distinct trajectories in their historical evolution. A pivotal disparity between Byzantium and the Latin Christendom lay in their governance structures, whereas Western Europe saw a separation between church and local governments, with supreme authority vested in the papacy. The Byzantine Empire upheld a unified governance model, where church and state were intertwined. Rooted in their Roman heritage, Byzantine emperors assumed dual roles as secular sovereigns and the appointers of the patriarch, the preeminent religious figure within the Orthodox sphere. This amalgamation of temporal and ecclesiastical authority underscored the unique administrative framework of Byzantine monasticism. Originally, monks were ordered to live close to their people, not in isolation like in other places, but instead regularly interacting with their community. This was not an accident. In order to better understand the needs and wants of their community, they lived with the population and even married with local women. Furthermore, because of their close ties to their communities, they could be depended on for support in times of crisis. They often gave help to the poor and others in need, and were very charitable and pious. Though this would lead to intense feuding with imperial authorities. Why? People increasingly were turning to the monasteries more than to the church, simply because they understood them better. Emperors like Justinian had used his state to impose religious unity across the empire, and these monasteries allowed people's faith to diverge from the established liturgy. This divergence reached a zenith during the iconoclast controversy, initiated by Emperor Leo III's decree banning religious icons, aimed at curbing the perceived influence of monasteries. Ultimately, these efforts proved unsuccessful, highlighting the enduring resilience and influence of monastic institutions in shaping religious and social dynamics within Byzantine society. To recap, monasteries in Latin Christendom and the Byzantine Empire had become politically involved in various ways, but stayed true to their community and monastic lifestyle. I would rather die going to the West than live by staying in the East. Buddhist monk Xuanzang. Originally rejected by the Chinese people, in an age of chaos and uncertainty following the fall of the Han, Buddhism's message of compassion resonated with the Taoist population. Buddhist missionaries first arrived in China via the Silk Road in the 2nd century AD. During the Han dynasty, the formation of the Mahayana school of Buddhism would become accepted across China and in most other parts of East Asia. Mahayana, which means great vehicle in Sanskrit, emphasizes the path of the Bodhisattva, a being who seeks enlightenment not just for oneself, but for all sentient beings. This school of Buddhism is notable for its expansive range of scriptures, philosophical diversity, and broad geographical spread. It would also integrate well with Taoism. Over the course of the 6th to 9th century, two new branches of Buddhism would be created: Pure Land Buddhism and Chen or Zen Buddhism. Newly set up monasteries used the Taoist vocabulary to translate Buddhist texts into Chinese, further helping spread their message. These institutions transmitted literature, art, and philosophy. They were centers of culture. In many ways, they were like their European counterparts. They existed as hubs of welfare and spiritual support. Another similarity to Europe was their immense wealth. These grand monasteries grew so wealthy off of donations, but often the emperor would become fearful of their power. Some emperors particularly disliked Buddhism and saw it as non-Chinese and too powerful, using their own power to reject Buddhism and limit its influence. 4 times in Chinese history, Buddhism was greatly persecuted. In 446 AD, the devout Taoist emperor Tai Wu of northern Wei discovered weapons inside Buddhist monasteries during a military campaign. Believing Buddhists to be against him, he banned Buddhism and slaughtered countless Buddhists in the region. His grandson, Emperor Wencheng, would end the ban, ironically being a Buddhist himself. In 574 and 577 AD, Emperor Wu of the Northern Zhou dynasty destroyed Buddhist and Taoist imagery and returned the clergy back to lay life. He confiscated their immense wealth and property and gave it to his soldiers. Compared to the first persecution, it was mostly bloodless. In 845 AD, Emperor Wuzong of the Tang dynasty, a devout Taoist, stripped Buddhism of its financial wealth and forced the clergy back into lay life. An excerpt from a Chinese document recalling his edict in 845 reads, "On the Gangxi day, in the 7th month of autumn, the emperor issued an edict to restrict the numbers of Buddhist monasteries under heaven. As most of the monasteries under heaven are to be closed, bronze statues, bells, and gongs should be handed over to the Salt and Iron Monopoly Commissioner to be cast into coins." Emperor Wuzong believed that these monasteries were too wealthy, powerful, and owned too much land. He would ultimately end up destroying 4,600 Buddhist temples, 40,000 shrines, and removing around 260,500 monks and nuns from monasteries. He considered Buddhism to be a harmful foreign influence. This would eventually be labeled as the Great Anti-Buddhist Persecution. Finally, in 1955, Emperor Shizong of the later Zhou dynasty ordered Buddhist statues to be melted so that he had copper to mint coins. Although the evidence is unclear, it is speculated that some of the clergy was either killed or forced back into lay life, and Buddhist temples were destroyed. These were the 4 Buddhist persecutions in China. In addition to those, during the Song dynasty, the rise of Neo-Confucianism led to a rejection of Buddhism and asserted itself as the most important religion to Chinese society. Neo-Confucians believed that its egalitarian philosophy destroyed the social system of the upper and lower classes. It is clear that Buddhist monasteries in China often found themselves under political attack by the government because of their immense wealth and influence. But it cannot be understated how culturally, religiously, and socially important these institutions were to China and its inhabitants. There is nothing in the whole world so painful as feeling that one is not liked. Say Shonagon. The last section of monasteries that will be discussed is of those in medieval Japan. Japan during the medieval period was very similar to China. After the arrival of Buddhism in the year 52 AD, emperors founded a monastery in each of the provinces, similar to the Chinese style. Like the other monasteries that have been discussed, they were religious centers that performed spiritual rituals. They also became immensely wealthy, like their Chinese and European counterparts, but distinctly, these donations came from nobles that went to the monasteries to avoid paying taxes. Overall, though, Japanese monasteries wouldn't be worth mentioning if it wasn't for one period in medieval Japan: the cloistered government. For context, the Fujiwara clan, the most powerful family in Japan, used their position as regent over the emperor's children to effectively have a chokehold on the government and be in control. When the current emperor would have a child, The Fujiwara regents would step in and rule in the place of the child until he was of age. This effectively gave them control, making the emperor a figurehead. Eventually, though, instead of abdicating when his child is born, the emperor would retire to a monastery, which would be outside the Fujiwara's control, and form a shadow government there. The monks in these monasteries would become loyal advisors to the emperor. The common people did not know who to believe, who was in charge. This would eventually come to an end at the start of the Genpei War and the rule of the Kamakura shogunate. Japan's monasteries mirrored many aspects of their Chinese and European counterparts, until the era of the cloistered government. Here, emperors strategically abdicated and entered monasteries, forming secret governments to escape the grip of the powerful Fujiwara clan. In this unusual twist, monasteries became political sanctuaries, blurring the line between religious retreat and ruling court. The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. Suleiman the Magnificent. Offering food, lodging, and a free education, madrasas spread rapidly throughout the Muslim world, and although their curricula varied from place to place, a common misconception is that they were all completely religious. This is not true. Madrasas were more than religious seminaries. They were comprehensive institutions that taught theology, science, philosophy, and law. In the Abbasid world, they unified Sunni identity and promoted religious scholarship. Later, in the Ottoman Empire, they became tools for reshaping the elite, replacing the politically troublesome Janissaries with educated bureaucrats loyal to the Sultan. For over a millennium, madrasas have played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting Islamic knowledge, shaping the intellectual and spiritual life of the Muslim world. Before we discuss the universities of the European world, it is important to mention their Muslim counterparts. It all starts with their rise in importance in the late 11th century. The first formal madrasas were created in Baghdad during the reign of the Abbasid Caliphate. Almost all the time they were built in or around the mosque. These institutions assisted the state in spreading Sunni teachings and countering Shia Islam that was predominant in the region of modern-day Iran. They helped create a common identity among the people by spreading their religious message and teachings. Overall, they provided an education for men, secular and religious, but also occasionally allowed women to attend lectures. This led to a dramatic rise in literacy and education rates during the 11th to 14th centuries, called the Islamic Golden Age. Many various curriculums were taught, such as logic, mathematics, and astrology, which was particularly important to the Muslim religion, and much more. A big distinction between these and the universities of Western Europe was that most of their scholars attending madrasas were working under the support of royal courts, not by free will, although that was not always the case. In addition to the many fields of study they taught, the four schools of religious law, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali, were taught, and the Quran became the core for learning. The madrasas were a center of legal and theological study and interpretation. The importance of this cannot be understated. It allowed more study and new interpretations of the Hadith and Sharia. Although this would blur the lines between church and the state, they often had a more defined systematic bureaucratic role in the government compared to European universities, although they both existed to create an educated elite. In the Ottoman Empire, madrasas were used to diminish the power of the Janissaries in the government and create a new formal educated elite. Janissaries were elite slave infantry units in the Ottoman Empire that were composed of Christian boys who were taken from the Balkans and converted to Islam. They also had considerable influence within the Ottoman state, sometimes intervening in politics and even causing instability in the empire during periods of decline, hence why the Sultan wanted them gone, despite their past effectiveness on the battlefield. Overall, madrasas were religious institutions of higher learning in the Islamic world that helped create a common religious identity, taught various fields and curriculums to foster an educated elite, and helped further legal and theological interpretation. These institutions were similar to their Western counterparts, but were very different at the same time. The soul of youth is a most holy sanctuary. Pope St. Pius X. For this section we will discuss only universities in Western Europe, since that is where our modern system stems from. But there are notable universities in other places of the world that are worth mentioning. Although it is debated whether it is a university or not, since it was originally a madrasas, founded in 859 AD, is recognized as the world's oldest university. It was one of the leading centers of learning in the Islamic world. First created in the Ghana Empire, and later expanded by Mansa Musa in the Mali Empire, the university in Timbuktu was another center of learning in the Islamic world. Some institutions were propped up in India and Southeast Asia, but did not always stand the test of time for various reasons. China built universities during the Tang and the Sung dynasties. Korea and Japan built some institutions for higher learning in the medieval period, but are not classified as universities. In post-Carolingian Europe, rulers needed more competent literate men to run their increasingly more dense and complex bureaucracies. They wanted to replace undeserving families with men that have merit, that deserve it. Hence the rise of universities in Europe. The University of Bologna, established in 1088, is the oldest university in Europe. The first official university, with the Pope's approval, was the University of Paris, after Pope Gregory IX issued the Bull Parin Scientiarum. More universities would be built all across Western Europe, usually developing from the old cathedral schools that existed. The Catholic Church obviously played a vital role in their development. They provided financial support and promoted the pursuit of knowledge. At the time, many of the early teachers or professors were clergy or religious scholars. Over time, though, this would change, and they would become more secular. This does not mean, however, that they were religious institutions like the Madrasas. They were much more secular in nature. Apart from teaching theology, they taught law, medicine, and the liberal arts, and many more. Liberal arts are still taught in most modern Western universities, and serve as a basis for higher learning. A side effect of universities was the promotion of vernacular language. For example, instead of being taught in Latin at the University of Paris, you would instead be taught in French, and read papers translated into French. This slowly developed papers and lectures being written in local languages, instead of Latin. This would help the furthering of the development of modern nation-states as we know today, but also pushing them away from the papacy at the same time. Finally, universities supplied their rulers with a literate, educated class to staff their bureaucracies, while also giving rise to vernacular language, promoting the independence of that country. From Latin Christendom to the Abbasid Caliphate, from Tang China to medieval Japan, institutions of higher learning, monasteries, madrasas, and universities were the beating heart of intellectual life. They shaped civilizations, educated rulers, preserved ancient knowledge, and sometimes resisted the very powers that tried to control them. In many ways, the modern world stands on the shoulders of these medieval giants.
Don't just watch. Join the tribe and go subscribe. Tales of History.